The revolution in Russia of 1917 was just as momentous as that in France of 128 years before, and the ramifications just as earth-shattering. Once again, when we see history unfold here, we see a similar pattern to that of France of the 18th century, and tragically, we see the same spiritual history unfold and find repetition. And so we find the same four-stage process as in the case of France. Firstly, the church grows spiritually weak. There's enormous laxity among the clergy. The people begin to lose faith in the church and so start to look for new alternatives. And once again, too, we see that Satan raises up a godless, demonic new idea, a new philosophy that promises to give them freedom and happiness. As a result, the church itself starts to lose power. Its lampstand is removed from its place, as John speaks of in Revelation, and the true church ends up a small, persecuted group, with most professing Christians having been deceived and joining the new false official state church. In the year 1917, Russia found itself on the brink of economic disaster, much like France of the 18th century. The Tsar, though himself a godly man, had grown so far removed from the peasantry that he didn't properly grasp how serious was the suffering of his own people. It was a mistake for which he and the aristocratic class were to pay in blood. Most important of all, and also as in the case of France in 1789, the church had become spiritually dull, spiritually decadent, with much of the priests and leadership so worldly that there was little difference between them and the world they professed to be trying to save. Let's take a look at some examples of this. To understand the Russian clergy at the turn of the 20th century, just a few decades before the revolution, we need to look no further than at the spiritual state of the students at theological seminaries, which had reached an all-time low in terms of spirituality and a fear of God. A 2006 article from the academic journal Russian Studies and History provides disturbing sketches of worldliness and debauched activities among students in the seminaries at this time. We're informed that instead of enriching the students, quote, the education received in the seminary deadened a person's natural faith. Perhaps much like today, but we're going to get into that a bit later. We're also informed that, quote, many started drinking, smoking, and clashing with their teachers. Metropolitan Evlogy, famous for his fierce opposition to the Uniate Church, remembered, they drank for various reasons, to celebrate name days, to toast a happy event, good news, or just some success or other. Wine destroyed many. The records of everyday life in the seminaries are horrific and anything but holy. Quote, the more senior pupils browbeat their juniors, stole their money, turned them into servants, and sent them out for cigarettes. Although vodka drinking and smoking were surreptitious in the dormitories, in the apartments the binges were more or less an open secret, and the fun and games often ended with a visit to a tavern or even a brothel. Fisticuffs were very much the order of the day. Students fought with one another, with their neighbours, with cab drivers, and so on. Everyone knew how aggressive these good fathers in the making were, and the seminarians, for their part, revelled in their reputation. Another eyewitness account records a typical student day. You would attend to prayers with 300 to 400 people standing in that huge hall, and you knew that a third or a half of them had nothing in common with the seminary, and neither interest in nor sympathy for the priestly vocation. They sang the prayers in chorus, but I could hear that they were singing not with religious feeling but with spite. If they could have, they would have smashed the seminary to all pieces. The seminary authorities recorded not only religious indifference, but even actual blasphemy. Not attending the liturgy, avoiding confession, tearing up church books, and so forth. It is scarcely believable that future ministers could act this way, but this is apparently how bad things were. The priests themselves were not much better. Accusations against priests included that he, quote, has a mistress, is often drunk, and that, quote, the church became the scene of a huge number of quarrels, even fights. The comment of one onlooker is tragic. He reflects common feeling at the time of the revolution when he says, the priests are to blame for the decline of religion. The priests are responsible for their own stigmatization in the newspapers. Why in all this time have the newspapers not attacked priests of other faiths? Because the other priests comprise men of ideals, true believers, whereas ours are artisans, like blacksmiths or carpenters, and care nothing for anything else. Religion, that is. Give us a different kind of priest. Then our faith will stop marking time. These are not members of holy orders, but priestly hacks. Now when church mores reach this level, when priest and student alike become this worldly, the church and the nation it serves is heading for trouble. This is precisely the sort of thing that can give a foothold to the devil. Satan can, on the basis of this, gain a legal right to usher in his own ungodliness and disorder, not only in the church, but also in the country in question. In fact, we see this very disaster starting to unfold, the very fabric of Russia as a nation beginning to unravel as we dig deeper into the history of the day. And what do we know about a people who neglect and forsake the true religion? They replace it with a false religion, something to fill the void that the religion vacated. And if they are spiritually blind enough, Satan will readily supply that false religion or dogma. In the 19th century, Karl Marx had bequeathed communism to the world, a system that was to be responsible for the deaths of 100 million people and misery and suffering for millions of others. By the late 19th century, early communist agitators had begun to filter into Russian society. It was not long before they set their sights on the church. One of their first ports of call was to infiltrate the seminaries themselves. It is said that Satan roams about the earth like a lion, seeking whom he may devour. The spiritually dead students were a quick foil for the wily communist agitators. Step by step, stealth by stealth, the underground communists sought very slowly to convert the impressionable seminary student to Marxism and Marxist doctrine. They did this by a gradual, stage-by-stage process. Quote, the senior pupils drew the attention of diverse radical organizations, and although often incapable of distinguishing between populists and Marxists, responded readily to oppositionist appeals. The propagandized became leaders within the seminaries and began recruiting sympathizers, using the conventional psychological ruses. Older pupils made friends with first years, greeted them with deferential handshakes, dropped in to see them during lesson breaks, and so forth. The flattered freshmen easily fell into the snares of the revolutionaries, who then recommended reading material from the illicit library that existed in every seminary. The first books recommended were such that secular society would consider innocuous: Pushkin, Tolstoy, Turgenev. Then came manuscript broadsheets for which the plotters themselves wrote verses and articles. Next began the discussion of an idea. In this way, a circle of initiates was formed. Even in the 1890s, seminarians were invited to Marxist readings. In the early 1900s, they were called upon to provoke clashes at textile mills. It comes as something of a shock to learn that about 15% of the early Socialist Party was made up of former seminary students. Of course, we know that Stalin was himself, tragically and horrifically, a former seminary student. Such is the fate of a church that is spiritually asleep and oblivious to the wiles of the devil. Some might even say sleeping in Gethsemane. And so we see a similar phenomenon as that which had taken place with Voltaire in 18th century France. The church set a bad spiritual example, and the likes of Voltaire, and possibly others, exchanged the truth for a lie, to quote Paul in Romans 1, embraced a false dogma, a pseudo-religion, instead of the true one. How utterly vital it is to ensure that we, the church, are providing a solid witness to the world. We don't know how we may be influencing people who may go on to become the movers and shakers of the system. If the clerical powers of the day had been closer to God and had brought the vital things of God into their seminaries, the doctrines of Karl Marx would have been less able to take hold there. But Satan was waiting in the wings, awaiting that opportunity to infiltrate and entrench his false doctrine amidst even the people of God. If the church does not give the people hope and a real God to serve, Satan will be only too happy to step in and offer an alternative, if not a religion. The 2006 article on the then state of Russian seminaries identifies clearly this phenomenon of the substitute religion. We saw that the French Revolution philosophy was nothing more than a substitute religion in the minds of the intellectuals. We see exactly the same thing in the case of communism. The article includes the example of a young man called Eugeny Preobrazhensky. Like so many of that generation, young Eugeny was witness to a weak carnal church, and this influenced him away from Christianity. Because of what he saw at the early age of 14, he rejected religion and became an atheist. He subsequently went on to become a leading communist of the day. It is a sad tale, one that has strong ramifications for us today. According to the article, young Eugeny soon experienced, quote, a revulsion against religion that grew steadily stronger due to his access to religion's back rooms, with all that went on behind the scenes there. In this instance, an intrinsically high-minded individual simply replaced one faith with another. And this is exactly what I've been saying about substitute religion. The representatives of the true religion provide a bad witness, and so the unbeliever seeks fulfilment elsewhere. He seeks another religion or religious system. He simply replaced one faith with another. In this case, the false religion of communism. When we put politics above God as a means of saving us, we commit idolatry. Do not forget that many of the isms birthed since the Enlightenment take on the form of religious substitutes. They may not look like religions, but effectively they are embraced and followed with as much zeal as is a religion. Philosopher Raymond Aron, in his work The Opiate of the Intellectual, exposes communism as little more than a religion. Again we find the same telltale signs that accompany the French Jacobins. The unthinking zeal with which the communists wished to take their creed to the ends of the earth and set the supposed captive free. The idea of setting up a perfect utopian state, a sort of heaven on earth. The messianic-like awe in which Joseph Stalin and later Mao Zedong and others were held. In the case of communism, there was a further curious indication of religion. For many years the body of Lenin was interred in Moscow, but perfectly preserved for all to see, lying permanently in state. Historian Jacques Bauzin, in his monumental work From Dawn to Decadence, exposed the psychology behind this. Lenin's perfectly preserved body lying in the tomb became little more than a sort of communist answer to Jesus as Messiah. It is almost as if to say, yes, we have our Messiah, our Saviour figure, who brought liberty to millions, and he too has defied death in his tomb. See how he has defied the decay of death. The tragedy then is that when the church grows too weak, Satan's given permission to give the world a false religion and false messianic figure to herald it. Communism, in fact, is full of false messianic figures. Figures heralded by their people as saviours, but who are really brutal dictators. They include the likes of Stalin, Mao, and also Pol Pot and Che Guevara, among others. And looking to the future, might this also be how the Antichrist could rise to power? The end times will be a time when the church will grow so weak and so apostate that Satan will gain a legal foothold to introduce a false antichristal religion, and with it a false Messiah, the Antichrist. This figure will promise to bring liberty and happiness to millions, but instead will bring only oppression and misery.